The dust never truly settles on a long cattle drive. It just finds new places to live. In your clothes, in your throat, in the cracks of your soul. We'd been pushing 1,000 head of longhorn north for 2 months, and the whole world had shrunk to the smell of hot leather, tired horses, and the endless, aching horizon. Our world was governed by two things: the trail boss, Flint, and the dinner bell. Flint's law was swift and hard. The dinner bell's law was simple. You don't eat, you don't work. And the man who rang that bell was Silas. He was the camp cook, a man carved from old hickory and silence. He had a face like a dried-up riverbed, with a white scar that ran from his left eyebrow to the corner of his mouth, pulling his lip into a permanent, grim little smile. No one asked about the scar. No one asked Silas much of anything. He joined the outfit 3 years back, and in all that time, I reckon he hadn't spoken more than 100 words total. He just cooked, and his cooking was the one piece of heaven you'd find in that dusty hell. His stew could warm a man right down to his bones. His biscuits were light enough to float. He kept the chuck wagon spotless, his pots and pans gleaming like treasure in the dying sun. The chuck wagon was his kingdom, and its laws were absolute. Chief among them, you don't touch the stores. Not a biscuit, not a bean, not a strip of jerky. Everything was measured, rationed to last us till we hit Kansas. Stealing from the wagon wasn't just theft. It was a threat to every man on that drive. It was a hanging offense in some outfits. With Flint, it was worse. He'd leave you in the middle of the plains with no horse, no water, and one bullet. He called it a courtesy. So when I saw the hands slip into the shadows of the wagon that night, my blood ran cold. Two of them. Small, wiry figures moving like ghosts in the moonlight. I was on late watch circling the herd and had ridden in quiet for a cup of coffee to fight the sleep. I reined in my horse, tucking back behind a cluster of mesquite, my heart hammering against my ribs. They were boys. Couldn't be much older than 16, the pair of them. They weren't part of our crew. Strays we'd picked up a few days back, found half-starved near a dried-up creek bed. Flint had been against it. More mouths, less water, he'd grumbled. But even Flint couldn't leave children to the coyotes. He told them they could trail along till we reached the next town, so long as they stayed out of the way and didn't cause trouble. The older one, with dark, haunted eyes, had just nodded. The younger one, who looked like a stiff breeze could carry him away, clutched his brother's hand and never said a word. Now here they were, causing trouble of the worst kind. I watched as the older boy, Leo, boosted the younger one, Finn, onto the wagon's tailgate. Finn slipped over the side, silent as a whisper. A moment later, a canvas sack was lowered down. It wasn't heavy, but I knew what was in it. Hardtack, jerky. Maybe a small bag of dried apples if they were lucky. Enough to keep them from starving, but enough to get them killed. Leo grabbed the sack, and for a second, I thought they'd bolt right then. But they didn't. They froze. A shadow had detached itself from the other side of the fire. A tall, stooped figure holding a ladle like a scepter. It was Silas. He'd been there the whole time watching. My hand went to my pistol. This was it. He'd shout. Flynn and the boys would come running. By sunrise, those two kids would be a dark speck on the horizon, walking toward a slow, lonely death. I held my breath, waiting for the shout that would seal their fate. But it never came. Silas just stood there in the moonlight, his scarred face unreadable. He watched the boys, two frightened jackrabbits caught in the open. The older one, Leo, shoved his little brother behind him, his chin jutted out in defiance, clutching that stolen sack like it was his last stand on earth. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. The only sound was the crackle of the campfire and the lowing of the herd. Silas took a slow step forward, then another. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise a hand. He just looked at them, that strange, crooked smile fixed on his face. He lifted the ladle, not to point or threaten, but to scratch at the back of his neck. He stared right at Leo, right at the sack of stolen food. Then he did the strangest thing I'd ever seen. He turned his back. He walked back to the fire, slow and deliberate, as if he'd seen nothing more than a tumbleweed rolling past. He picked up his big stew pot and began to stir, the rhythmic scrape of the ladle the only sound in the night. The boys stood frozen for another 10 seconds, their faces a mix of terror and disbelief. Then Leo grabbed Finn's arm and they melted back into the darkness, clutching their stolen rations. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My mind was reeling. Why? Why would Silas let them go? He was the guardian of the stores, the one man who took the rules of the chuck wagon more seriously than Flint himself. I'd once seen him dress down a seasoned cowhand for taking a second biscuit without asking, and now he'd witnessed grand theft and done nothing. It made no sense. It was a crack in the foundation of our world. Silas, the unmoving rock, had just looked the other way. I knew right then and there that this wasn't over. A secret that big on a trail this long doesn't stay buried. It festers, it grows, and sooner or later, it was going to explode. I stayed hidden in the mesquite, my coffee forgotten. I watched Silas stir his pot, his back to the camp, a lone, silent figure framed against the flames. He hadn't just ignored a crime, he had become part of it, and I was the only one who knew. The next morning, the air was thick with a tension only I seemed to feel. The boys, Leo and Finn, kept to themselves, huddled near the remuda, their eyes darting around like spooked foals. They gnawed on their stolen jerky when they thought no one was looking, guilt and fear etched on their thin faces. Flint was in a foul mood. He stalked around the camp, his gaze sweeping over everything, looking for something out of place. He stopped by the chuck wagon, running a critical eye over the stores. "Everything accounted for, Silas?" he barked. Silas didn't look up from the skillet of bacon he was frying. He just grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. For him, it meant yes. Flint stared at the back of Silas's head for a long moment. He knew his men. He knew his cook. He could smell a secret a mile away. But Silas was a closed book, a locked door. Flint narrowed his eyes, then turned and stalked off to chew out one of the wranglers for a loose cinch. I watched the exchange, my stomach in a knot. Silas was lying. A bold, silent lie to the one man you didn't lie to on the trail. This wasn't just protecting two hungry kids anymore. This was something else. Silas was playing a dangerous game, and I couldn't figure out the rules. All day I kept an eye on him, but he was the same as always. Silent, efficient. He moved with a purpose that bordered on ritual, grinding coffee, kneading dough, peeling potatoes. Not a flicker of emotion crossed his scarred face. He was a stone wall, but I'd seen the crack. I knew something was behind it. That evening, as the sun bled across the sky, the smell of Silas's stew filled the air. It was richer than usual, with chunks of beef and wild onions he'd found along a creek. The men lined up, tin plates in hand, tired and hungry. Flint took his portion first, then the rest of us. It was the best part of the day, a small comfort in a hard life. The two boys, Leo and Finn, hung back. They didn't have plates. They weren't part of the crew, so they weren't part of the meal. That was Flint's rule. They were allowed to trail with us, not feast with us. They'd have to make do with what they'd stolen. I watched them from the corner of my eye as I ate. The younger one, Finn, stared at the stew pot with a longing so powerful you could almost taste it. His stomach rumbled loud enough for me to hear from 10 feet away. The older boy, Leo, put a protective arm around his brother and whispered something, trying to pull him away. But Finn was mesmerized by the smell, by the sight of men eating hot food under the stars. It was a world he couldn't enter. The last man got his plate, and Silas began to clean up. He scraped the leftovers for the coyotes, as he always did, and started washing the massive pot. The boys watched him, their last hope dwindling. Finally, Leo tugged Finn's arm, and they turned to leave, to go back to their cold bedroll and their dry jerky. That's when Silas did it. He stopped washing. He set down the pot, wiped his hands on his apron, and turned toward his workstation inside the wagon. The firelight flickered across his back. He reached up to a high shelf and took down 2 tin plates. They were his own private stash, cleaner and less dented than the ones the crew used. He moved back to the fire, picked up the big ladle, and dipped it deep into a smaller pot he'd kept simmering on the coals, one I hadn't noticed before. He filled the first plate to the brim with thick, hearty stew. Then he filled the second. He placed a fat, golden biscuit beside each mound of stew. He didn't call out to the boys. He didn't say a word. He just set the 2 plates on the edge of the wagon's tailgate, the steam curling up into the twilight. Then, without a backward glance, he went back to his washing, his movements as steady and methodical as ever. It was an invitation, a silent, profound statement that defied every rule of the trail, every law Flint had laid down. He hadn't just ignored their crime, he was now rewarding them for it. Leo and Finn had stopped walking. They turned, their eyes wide with disbelief. They looked at the plates. They looked at Silas's back. They looked at each other. For a full minute, they didn't move, as if they were afraid it was a trap. Finally, slowly, Leo led his little brother toward the wagon. They approached the plates like they were approaching a wild animal. Leo reached out a trembling hand and picked one up. Finn took the other. They scurried back into the shadows, and the sound of their grateful, hurried eating was the only proof it had even happened. I sat by the fire, my own meal forgotten. My mind was a whirlwind. This wasn't just mercy. Mercy is turning a blind eye once. This was deliberate. This was a choice. Silas had risked Flint's wrath not once, but twice for 2 boys he didn't even know. The question burned in my gut, hotter than the campfire. Why? What did he see in those 2 starving strays that made him willing to break a code he had lived by for years? I looked at his scarred face, illuminated by the fire, and for the first time, I realized that his silence wasn't empty. It was full of something. Something he was hiding from all of us. And I had a terrible feeling we were all about to find out what it was. The 2 saved plates changed everything. It became a silent routine. Every night after the crew had eaten, Silas would set out 2 full plates on the tailgate. Every night, Leo and Finn would creep out of the darkness to claim them. They never spoke to Silas. He never spoke to them. It was a quiet contract, sealed in stew and biscuits. The change in the boys was remarkable. With regular food in their bellies, the hollows in their cheeks began to fill out. The constant, hunted look in their eyes softened just a little. Finn even managed a small smile once when one of the wranglers showed him a rope trick. Leo remained watchful, a young wolf guarding his pack, but the rigid line of his shoulders eased. They started to look less like ghosts and more like boys. But secrets on a cattle drive have a way of leaking out, like water from a bad canteen. The other hands started to notice. A whisper here, a questioning glance there. "Since when does Flint allow charity?" one of them muttered. "Silas has gone soft," another grumbled. They didn't dare say anything to Silas directly, but they talked amongst themselves, and their talk was tinged with suspicion. Food was survival. Giving it away to strays felt like a betrayal of the group. It upset the natural order of things. Flint noticed too. Of course he noticed. The man could spot a lame steer from a mile away. He wasn't going to miss 2 extra plates of food disappearing every night. One evening, he walked over to the chuck wagon just as Silas was setting the plates on the tailgate. He stopped right behind the cook, his shadow falling over the steaming plates. "That's a mighty generous portion for the coyotes tonight, Silas," Flint said, his voice low and sharp as a skinning knife. Silas didn't flinch. He finished placing a biscuit on the second plate before turning around slowly. He looked Flint square in the eye. His scarred mouth was set in that grim, unreadable line. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't offer an explanation. He just stood there waiting. It was a standoff. The immovable object versus the unstoppable force. The law of the camp versus the law of a man's own heart, whatever that law might be. The entire camp went quiet, watching. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Leo and Finn, who had been about to step into the firelight, shrank back into the deep shadows, their brief sanctuary threatened. Flint's hand rested on the butt of his Colt. "That's crew rations, cook, not a handout for every stray dog that wanders into camp." Silas's gaze didn't waver. He simply gestured with his chin toward the main supply crates. "Counted the sacks this morning, boss," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "We're ahead of schedule. Got a surplus." It was the most I'd heard him say in a month. And it was a lie. A bald-faced lie. We were perfectly on schedule, maybe even a little behind. There was no surplus. He was drawing from his own rations, making his own meals smaller, stretching the portions so that no one in the crew went without, while still having enough for the boys. I'd seen him do it. taking only half a biscuit for himself, drinking his coffee black when I knew he liked sugar. Flint knew it was a lie, too. He was no fool. His eyes narrowed, searching Silas's face for the truth. But there was nothing to find, just that stony silence, that unwavering stare. Flint was a man who understood rules and force. He didn't understand this. It was a language he didn't speak. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Flint broke the standoff. "See that it don't affect the men," he snarled and turned on his heel, stalking back to the main fire. The crisis was averted, but the mystery only deepened. Silas hadn't just lied. He'd challenged the trail boss. He'd drawn a line in the dust around those two boys and dared anyone to cross it. The stakes were getting higher. This was no longer about a few stolen biscuits. This was about defiance. Later that night, my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know. I waited until the camp was asleep. Then I made my way toward the chuck wagon. Silas was sitting on the tailgate, cleaning a rifle with meticulous care. The two boys were there, huddled near him, finishing the last of their stew. It was the first time I'd seen them all together. They weren't talking, just sharing the same small space. It was almost peaceful. I must have made a sound because Leo's head shot up. His eyes flashed with alarm, and he instinctively moved to shield Finn. He was always on guard. Silas looked up at me, his movements unhurried. He set the rifle aside. "Jed," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Silas," I nodded. I gestured toward the boys. "Just wondering what's going on." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at the boys. There was something in his gaze. Not pity, not charity. It was something harder, something I couldn't name. Recognition, maybe? "They were hungry," he finally said, as if that explained everything. "People get hungry out here all the time," I pressed, keeping my voice low. "Flint would have left them. You lied to him, risked your place. For them. Why?" Leo was staring at me, his young face tight with suspicion. He clearly didn't trust me, or anyone. Silas picked up an oily rag and wiped down the rifle stock. "Some things are more important than rules, Jed. Some debts need paying." Debts? What debt could he possibly owe to these two ragged kids? As he spoke, something small and metallic slipped from the pocket of the younger boy, Finn. He'd been fiddling with it, and it fell to the ground with a soft clink. It was a small silver locket, tarnished and dented, hanging on a broken chain. Before I could even register what it was, Leo snatched it up, his movements lightning fast. He shoved it back into his brother's pocket, his eyes darting from me to Silas, his body coiled like a snake ready to strike. He was terrified of us seeing it, but Silas had seen it. His hand stopped moving. He froze, his knuckles white around the oily rag. His gaze was fixed on the spot where the locket had fallen, a strange, haunted look coming over his face. That scarred, emotionless mask finally cracked, and underneath was a pain so deep it was startling. He knew that locket, I was sure of it. And in that one shared, silent moment, I realized this whole affair. The stolen food, the saved plates, the lies to Flint. It wasn't about the boys at all. It was about that small silver locket, and the story it carried was far more dangerous than a few stolen biscuits. The locket changed the air between them. Before, there was a silent understanding. Now, there was a silent question. Silas started watching the boys differently. His gaze would linger on them, a deep, searching look in his eyes, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't known was missing. He never asked about the locket, and the boys, especially Leo, guarded it like a holy relic. Leo became even more protective of his younger brother. He kept Finn closer, his hand often resting on the pocket where the locket was hidden. He seemed to understand that the old cook's kindness was now tangled up with that piece of silver, and it made him uneasy. He trusted the food, but he didn't trust the reason behind it. A few days later, we were crossing a wide, shallow river when it happened. Finn, riding on the back of one of the supply mules, slipped and fell into the current. It wasn't deep, but it was swift, and the boy was small. He went under, sputtering and flailing. Before anyone could react, Leo dove in after him, fighting the current. But he wasn't strong enough. The river was pulling them both downstream. Men started shouting. Flint yelled for ropes. But it was Silas who moved first. He dropped the reins of his wagon team and plunged into the river without a second's hesitation. He moved through the water with a surprising speed and power for a man his age. He reached the boys, grabbed them both by the scruff of their shirts, and dragged them toward the bank, his face set like granite. He hauled them onto the muddy shore, coughing and shivering. Finn was crying, more from fright than anything else. Leo just clung to his brother, gasping for air. As Silas helped Finn to his feet, the locket, heavy with water, slipped from his pocket again, dangling from its broken chain. This time, it swung free in the open air for everyone to see, and Flint saw it. He had ridden his horse into the shallows to help, and his eyes locked onto the small silver object swinging back and forth. His whole body went rigid. The color drained from his face, replaced by a dark, thunderous fury. "Where did you get that?" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. Leo instinctively tried to hide it, but it was too late. Flint was already off his horse, storming toward them. He grabbed Leo by the front of his wet shirt, lifting him half off the ground. "I asked you a question, boy. Where did you steal that locket?" "I didn't steal it," Leo choked out, his eyes wide with terror. "It was my pa's." "Liar." Flint's face was inches from Leo's, contorted with rage. He turned to the rest of us, his voice shaking with a cold, hard anger I'd never heard from him before. "I know this locket. It belonged to the Millers, a family murdered on their farmstead back near Dusty Creek 3 weeks ago. Their place was robbed, burned to the ground. Man, wife, 2 daughters, gone." A horrified silence fell over the riverbank. The men stared at the two boys, their expressions hardening. Strays were one thing, thieves were another. But accomplices to murder? That was a different story entirely. The only thing missing from that farm, besides a horse and some cash, was Martha Miller's silver locket. Flint continued, his voice dangerously low. "A gift from her mother. I saw it myself 100 times. He ripped the locket from Leo's grasp and held it up. The sun glinted off the tarnished silver. "You're with them, aren't you? The bastards who did it. The Corrigan gang." The name fell like a stone. Blackheart Corrigan. A name that struck fear into decent folk all across the territory. A ruthless killer who left nothing but bodies and ashes in his wake. Leo was shaking his head frantically, tears streaming down his face. "No, it's not true. We ran from him. He—" Leo's voice broke. "He what?" Flint sneered. "He cut you out of your share?" He threw Leo to the ground and turned to the other men. "Get the ropes. We'll get the truth out of them, and then we'll give them the same justice the Millers got." The men didn't hesitate. Their sympathy for the two hungry boys had vanished, replaced by cold, hard frontier justice. This was no longer about a few biscuits. This was about vengeance. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding. It couldn't be true. These kids, they weren't killers. I'd seen the fear in their eyes, but the evidence was damning. The locket was there, in Flint's hand. Two of the hands were already uncoiling their ropes. Leo scrambled to his brother's side, shielding him with his own body, a desperate, hopeless gesture. This was it. It was over. Then a voice cut through the tension, calm and steady. "Put the ropes down." It was Silas. He had been standing silently by, watching the whole scene unfold. Now he stepped forward, placing himself between Flint's men and the two boys. His face was a mask, but his eyes burned with an intensity I'd never seen before. Flint wheeled on him. "Stay out of this, Cook. This ain't your concern." "That locket," Silas said, his voice a low rasp, ignoring Flint's warning. "Let me see it." "You saw it," Flint spat. "It belongs to a dead woman." "Let me see it," Silas repeated, his voice harder this time. There was an authority in it that made the men pause. He held out his hand, palm up. Flint hesitated for a beat. Then with a frustrated growl, he tossed the locket to Silas. "Fine. Look all you want. It won't change what they are." Silas caught it. He didn't just look at it. He held it in his calloused palm with a strange reverence. He turned it over and over, his thumb tracing the intricate floral pattern on the front. Then with a flick of his thumbnail, he opened it. The inside of a locket is a private thing. A place for faces you want to keep close to your heart. Flint thought he knew whose face should be in there, but Silas knew better. He held the open locket out for Flint to see. Martha Miller was a blonde woman, wasn't she, Flint? Silas asked, his voice eerily calm. Flint squinted at the locket. Yeah, so? Then you tell me, Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, who this is. Inside the locket, there wasn't a portrait of a blonde woman. There was a tiny faded photograph of a woman with dark hair and a kind, smiling face. A face none of us had ever seen before. And on the other side, where a second photo might have been, was a small, crudely scratched inscription. Just one word. Always. A collective gasp went through the men. This changed everything. Flint's certainty, his righteous anger, it all began to crumble. He stared at the locket, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. That's not Martha Miller, he stammered. No, it's not, Silas said, his voice thick with an ancient grief. He snapped the locket shut. Her name was Elena. He looked up from the locket, his gaze meeting Flint's. The scar on his face seemed to stand out, a stark white line against his weathered skin. She was my wife. The silence that followed was absolute. The world seemed to stop. The river, the wind, the shuffling horses, it all faded away, leaving only Silas's words hanging in the air. She was my wife. Flint stared at him dumbfounded. The rest of us were just as stunned. Silas, the quiet cook, the man who was more a part of the wagon than a part of the crew, had a past that was now lying open and raw on the riverbank. Your wife? Flint finally managed to say. What are you talking about, Silas? The Corrigan gang killed the Millers. That's a fact. They did, Silas agreed, his voice flat. Corrigan leaves a lot of bodies. He's been doing it for years. The Millers were just the most recent. But this locket, he clenched his fist around it. This has nothing to do with them. Corrigan took this from me 10 years ago, the night he took everything else. He looked over at the two boys, Leo and Finn, who were huddled together, watching him with wide, frightened eyes. A piece of the puzzle clicked into place in my mind. He hadn't recognized the locket. He'd recognized the story it told, the story of running from Blackheart Corrigan. Who are you, Silas? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The whole crew was wondering the same thing. The man we thought we knew was a stranger. Silas finally looked away from the boys and met my gaze. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by something cold and hard, something I'd only ever seen in the eyes of lawmen and killers. My name isn't Silas, he said. His voice was different now, stripped of its gravelly rasp, clearer and sharper. It's Josiah Kane, and 10 years ago I was a Texas Ranger. Another shockwave rippled through the men. A ranger. It was impossible. Rangers were legends, hard men who chased down the worst of the worst. They weren't quiet camp cooks with scarred faces. I was part of a company tasked with infiltrating Corrigan's gang. Josiah, Silas continued, his eyes distant, lost in a memory. I went deep undercover, rode with him for 6 months. I was getting close, gathering enough evidence to hang him and his whole crew. But someone tipped him off. He figured me out. He paused and his hand unconsciously went to the scar on his face. He didn't just kill me. That would have been too easy. He wanted to make an example of me. He and his men rode to my homestead. My wife, Elena. She was there alone. He couldn't finish. He didn't have to. The grim picture formed in all our minds. They left me for dead. A bullet in my gut and his knife work on my face as a reminder. They burned my home to the ground, and he took her locket. He likes to take trophies. The story hung in the air, thick and heavy with tragedy. The man we knew as Silas had been forged in a fire none of us could imagine. His silence wasn't emptiness. It was a wall built around a core of grief and vengeance. I survived, he said, his voice like iron. But Josiah Kane, the ranger, he died that night. I became Silas, the cook. I've been drifting ever since, listening, waiting, following the trail of bodies Corrigan leaves behind. I knew one day I'd find him. I just never thought his trail would lead to 2 scared boys. He turned his full attention back to Leo and Finn. His voice softened, just a fraction. "Now you tell me, son," he said to Leo. "You said you ran from him, and you said this locket belonged to your pa. Tell me the truth, all of it." Leo, who had been listening with a mixture of fear and awe, finally found his voice. He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the locket in Josiah's hand. It, it did belong to our pa," he stammered. He, he rode with Corrigan." A murmur of contempt went through the crew. Flint's face hardened again. "So he was one of them?" "He was," Leo admitted, his voice cracking. "But he wasn't like them. Not really. He wanted out. He told us Corrigan was getting crazier, killing for sport. He was scared. He wanted to take us and run, start over somewhere new." Finn started to cry softly, burying his face in his brother's side. "A few weeks ago," Leo continued, his voice trembling as he relived the memory, "Pa came to us in the middle of the night. He gave me a horse and a sack of food. He gave Finn the locket. He said, he said it was a good luck charm he'd been holding for a long time. He told us to ride north and not stop for anything. He said he had to create a diversion, lead them away from us, but he'd meet us in Kansas." "And?" Josiah prompted gently. Leo's face crumpled. "He never came. We waited for 2 days. Then we heard Corrigan had caught a traitor in his own camp, made an example of him. We knew it was Pa, so we kept riding. We've been running ever since." The story was heartbreaking. The pieces all fit. Their father, a man trying to escape a dark past, had been one of Corrigan's men. The locket wasn't a trophy he'd stolen. It was likely something he'd held on to, maybe a token of a man he'd killed, a constant, heavy reminder of his sins. In his final moments, he gave it to his son, not as a prize, but as the only thing of value he had left, a desperate prayer for good luck. These boys weren't accomplices. They were orphans, running for their lives from the same man who had destroyed Josiah's world. Josiah knelt down in front of them. He opened his hand and showed the locket to Leo. "Your father, did he tell you where he got this?" Leo shook his head. "No, just said it would keep us safe." Josiah's scarred mouth twisted into a sad, bitter smile. "It didn't keep her safe," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. He closed his hand around the locket again, a silent vow passing over his face. He stood up and faced Flint. The entire dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the camp cook. He was Josiah Kane, the ranger, and this was his jurisdiction. "These boys are under my protection now, Flint," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that couldn't be challenged. "They're the bait I've been waiting for 10 years. Corrigan wants this locket. It's a trophy, a symbol of his victory over the law. But he also wants these boys. They're loose ends. They know his face, his habits. He won't let them live." Flint looked from Josiah to the boys, then back to the locket. The hard lines on his face were still there, but the righteous fury was gone, replaced by a dawning understanding. He had been wrong, terribly wrong. "He'll be tracking them," Josiah said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "He's patient, but he's not going to let them get away. He's coming." The implication was clear. Our cattle drive, our simple world of dust and beef, was about to collide with a storm of violence. We weren't just a crew of cowboys anymore. We were standing in the middle of a war, and it was riding toward us, fast. A new kind of quiet fell over the camp that night. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence of tired men sleeping under the stars. It was a coiled, watchful silence. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Josiah Kane was a man transformed. The stooped, shuffling cook was gone. In his place stood a man who moved with a quiet, deadly purpose. He checked every rifle in camp, handed out extra ammunition, and assigned guard posts with the calm efficiency of a seasoned commander. Flint, to his credit, didn't challenge him. He recognized a higher authority when he saw it. He'd made a terrible mistake, and he knew it. He deferred to Josiah's judgment, turning the security of the camp over to him without a word. The other cowhands followed suit. Fear and respect are powerful motivators, and Josiah commanded both. He brought the boys, Leo and Finn, to the main campfire. They were no longer outcasts. They were the center of our world, the reason the storm was coming. Josiah gave them fresh plates of stew, but this time he sat with them. "You're safe now," he told them, his voice low but firm. "He'll have to come through me to get to you, and a lot of other good men too." He nodded toward the rest of us, who were watching from a distance. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in Leo's eyes. He had been carrying the weight of the world on his young shoulders, and for the first time, someone was offering to share the load. Later, I found Josiah standing alone at the edge of camp, staring out into the vast, dark plains. The silver locket was in his hand, catching the faint starlight. "You really think he's coming?" I asked. "I know he is," Josiah replied without looking at me. "Corrigan's pride is as big as this territory. He can't stand loose ends, and he can't stand the thought of me being alive. If he has any inkling I am, he'll come. The locket is the key. The boy's father must have been there that night 10 years ago. Maybe he was the one who left me for dead. Maybe that's why he kept it." Guilt. It was a chilling thought. The boy's father might have been directly involved in Elena's death, but Josiah didn't seem to hold it against them. His fight wasn't with the past, it was with the man who had authored it. "What's the plan?" I asked. "We stop here," he said, gesturing to the landscape around us. We were in a small box canyon, a place Flint had chosen for its good water and grazing. It was defensible. A narrow entrance, high rock walls on three sides. We let the herd graze. We wait. We make our stand. "Just wait for him to find us?" "He'll find us," Josiah said with grim certainty. "He's got trackers that can follow a ghost across bare rock. He knows these boys are heading north. It's only a matter of time." The waiting was the hardest part. 2 days passed. The tension stretched thinner and thinner until the whole camp felt like it was about to snap. Men spoke in whispers. Every cowboy kept his rifle close and his eyes on the canyon entrance. The boys stayed close to Josiah. He didn't coddle them, but he watched over them. He started showing Leo how to properly clean a rifle, his hands moving over the steel parts with familiar ease. He taught Finn how to tie a dozen different knots, keeping his small hands and mind busy. He was gruff, but he was present. For two boys who had lost everything, that was more than enough. On the third morning, at dawn, it happened. The lookout we'd posted on the canyon rim came scrambling down, his face pale. "Riders," he gasped. "A dozen of them. Coming fast." A quiet alarm went through the camp. There was no panic. Josiah had drilled us on what to do. The horses were secured. The herd was pushed to the back of the canyon. The men took their positions behind the chuck wagon, supply crates, and natural rock formations. Josiah pulled Leo and Finn behind the chuck wagon, the most fortified position. "Stay down," he ordered. "No matter what you hear. You understand?" They both nodded, their faces tight with fear. Josiah looked at Leo. "I know you want to help, son. You've got the heart for it, but your job is to protect your brother. That's an order." He handed Leo an old Colt pistol. "You only use this if they get past me. You hear?" Leo took the gun with trembling hands and nodded again. Josiah then walked to the front line, taking his position behind a large boulder. He wasn't carrying the camp rifle he'd been cleaning. He was holding a beautiful, long-barreled rifle I'd never seen before. A Sharps, the kind buffalo hunters and Army Scouts used. He must have kept it hidden in the wagon all these years. In his hands, it looked like an extension of his own body. He laid the silver locket on the rock in front of him, a single gleaming piece of bait. The hoofbeats grew louder, a drumming thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Then they appeared at the mouth of the canyon. A dozen hard-looking men on wiry horses, led by a big man with a thick black beard and eyes like chips of obsidian. Blackheart Corrigan. He held up a hand, and his men reined in their horses, fanning out. His cold gaze swept across our camp, taking in our defensive positions. He smiled, a cruel, confident smirk. "Well, well," he called out, his voice booming across the canyon. "Look what we have here. A bunch of sodbusters playing soldier." He spit on the ground. "I'm looking for two little rats, a couple of boys. You give them to me, and we'll ride on by. You don't, well, this is a mighty nice spot for a graveyard." Flint stepped out from behind the wagon, his own rifle held ready. "The boys are with us. You want him? You'll have to come through us. Corrigan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. I always admire a man with sand. Right before I kill him, his eyes scanned our line again, and then they fell on Josiah. He squinted. The smile on his face faltered. A flicker of confusion, then dawning recognition, crossed his features. No, he whispered, his voice losing its confident boom. It can't be. Josiah stood up slowly from behind the boulder, the Sharp's rifle held loosely in one hand. He was in full view now. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, letting Corrigan see the scarred face he had carved himself. Corrigan's face went white. He had seen a ghost from a decade ago, a ghost he thought he'd personally sent to hell. Cain, he breathed, the name a curse on his lips. Hello, Corrigan, Josiah said, his voice calm and cold as a winter wind. It's been a long time. He tapped the silver locket on the rock with the barrel of his rifle. You came back for your trophy. I came back for you. The standoff was over. The reunion was complete. Corrigan's shock quickly turned to rage. He had been tricked, lured into a trap. His reputation, his power, was built on the idea that he was invincible, that his enemies stayed dead. Josiah's very existence was an insult he couldn't tolerate. Kill him, Corrigan screamed, his voice raw with fury. Kill them all. The canyon exploded with the roar of gunfire. What happened next wasn't a fight, it was a reckoning. Corrigan's men were outlaws, good in a stand-up brawl or a raid on an unarmed farmstead. But we were in a fortified position, and we were being led by a Texas Ranger. Josiah Cain was a force of nature. He fired the Sharp's rifle with a calm, methodical precision that was terrifying to behold. Every shot was a kill. He moved from cover to cover, directing our fire, calling out targets, his voice cutting through the chaos. He was a conductor, and our rifles were his orchestra of death. The cowhands, men who'd never been in more than a saloon scuffle, found a courage they didn't know they had. They followed Josiah's lead, laying down a steady, disciplined fire. Flint, fighting beside me, was a changed man. His shots were true, his jaw set, as if he were trying to atone for his earlier mistake with every bullet he fired. Corrigan's men, expecting an easy fight, were caught completely off guard. Their charge faltered. Men and horses went down. They were trapped in the open, with nowhere to go. I saw Corrigan, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, trying to rally his men. But their confidence was shattered. They were being picked apart. From behind the chuck wagon, I heard a yelp. I risked a glance back and saw one of Corrigan's men had managed to slip around the flank. He was trying to get to the boys. He had a knife in his hand and was lunging toward Finn. Leo, who had been shielding his brother, reacted on pure instinct. He raised the heavy Colt pistol Josiah had given him, both hands shaking, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked, and the outlaw crumpled to the ground, a look of surprise on his face. Leo stared at the fallen man, his own face a mixture of horror and shock. He had just taken a life to save his brother's. In that moment, he stopped being a boy and became something else, a survivor. The battle was short and brutal. Within minutes, it was over. The few of Corrigan's men who were still alive threw down their guns and surrendered. The canyon floor was littered with the dead and dying, but Corrigan himself was still standing. His horse was down, and he was using its body for cover. He was a cornered animal, wounded and desperate. Josiah started walking toward him, slow and deliberate, across the newly silent battlefield. He didn't raise his rifle. This was personal. It's over, Corrigan, Josiah said, his voice echoing in the canyon. Corrigan staggered to his feet, a pistol in his hand. Not till you're dead, Ranger, he screamed and fired. The shot went wide. Josiah didn't even flinch. He just kept walking. Corrigan fired again, and again, his shots wild with panic. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He threw the useless gun down in frustration. Josiah stopped 10 feet from him. For Elena, he said, his voice quiet. He raised the Sharp's rifle. Corrigan stared down the barrel of the gun, his eyes wide with the certainty of his own death. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The rifle roared, and Blackheart Corrigan's reign of terror ended in the dust of a box canyon. Josiah stood over the body for a long moment, the smoke curling from his rifle barrel. He looked down at the man who had taken everything from him, and I saw a decade of pain, grief, and rage finally begin to settle. It wasn't triumph on his face. It was just quiet. The end of a long, dark road. He walked back to the boulder where he'd made his stand. He picked up the silver locket and walked over to the chuck wagon, where Leo and Finn were just emerging, their eyes wide from what they'd witnessed. Josiah knelt down in front of them. The sounds of the aftermath, the wounded groaning, Flint shouting orders to round up the prisoners, faded into the background. He held out the locket. "This belongs to a ghost," he said softly, "and it's time she was put to rest." He didn't give it to them. He walked over to the smoldering campfire and, without ceremony, tossed it into the flames. We all watched as the silver blackened and warped, the face of his long-lost wife consumed by the fire, her memory finally released from the tarnished prison it had been trapped in for 10 years. He had hunted Corrigan for a decade, fueled by vengeance. But in the end, protecting those two boys had brought him not just his revenge, but something he thought he'd lost forever, a purpose. He turned back to Leo and Finn. "Your pa wanted to get you to Kansas, start a new life," he said. "I aim to see that he gets his wish." He placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "You'll ride with me now." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a new contract, sealed not in stew and biscuits, but in gunpowder and blood. Flint walked up, his hat in his hands. He looked at Josiah, then at the boys. There was a deep respect in his eyes. "Josiah," he said, "the herd is secure. The prisoners are tied up. We'll take them to the nearest town. Let the law handle them." He paused, then looked at the chuck wagon. "The trail is going to need a good cook." Josiah looked at the wagon, his old kingdom. Then he looked at the two boys who were now his responsibility. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his scarred lips. Not the grim, fixed line we were used to, but a real one. "The name's Josiah," he said, "but Silas will do just fine. I've got two hungry boys to feed." We buried our dead and cleaned up the canyon. The next morning, we pushed the herd north again. The world was the same dust, the same sun, the same endless horizon. But we were different. We were a crew that had faced down Blackheart Corrigan and won. And our quiet, mysterious cook was no longer a mystery. He was our anchor, our unlikely hero. He still didn't say much, but now his silence felt different. It felt like peace. Every evening, he still set out two plates on the tailgate of the chuck wagon. But Leo and Finn didn't have to sneak out of the shadows anymore. They sat right there with him in the warm glow of the firelight, as he told them quiet stories of the stars. They were the first words I'd ever heard him speak that weren't about the past, but about the future. The two saved plates had started as an act of strange, unexplained mercy for two hungry thieves. But they had become something more. They were a promise, a symbol of a new family, forged in the dust and fire of the American West. A quiet testament to the fact that even on the hardest trails, you can sometimes find your way home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.